Production support for InFocus is provided by Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The stakes of standardized testing have never been higher in Indiana. Test scores now determine whether third graders can advance to fourth grade. They can separate effective from ineffective teachers under a new rating system. They can trigger state reprimands, interventions, and even takeovers in schools with chronically poor scores. Supporters say statewide testing is the best way to close a persistent achievement gap between rich and poor students. But intense focus on scores and results has raised concerns about testing anxiety and questions about whether students are really learning more. Tonight, we discuss the effects of Indiana's statewide exams on students as we put high-stakes testing in focus. And thank you for joining us on this edition of InFocus. I'm Kyle Stokes, education reporter for State Impact Indiana, and we'll introduce you to our panel in just a moment. But first, Indiana students have taken a statewide assessment called the I-STEP for years. But for the first time this year, Indiana third graders were required to take another test called the I-Read 3. The exam is supposed to assess students' reading levels to make sure that they're ready to move on to the next grade level. As WTIU's Gretchen Frazee reports, those tests come on top of several other changes to school assessments.
Third graders have two chances to pass the I-Read 3 exam. If they fail it both times, they're held back in the third grade. Schools and students won't get the results until this summer, but after the first round of testing this month, parents and teachers do seem to have mixed feelings about the benefits of the assessments.
There's a lot of research, significant research, that shows retention does not benefit students. It has negative impact on their later achievement, and I do not think that's a good direction for us to be going in.
But parent Tanya McCrae, whose children are in the 3rd and 5th grade, says she thinks testing is good for students. In fact, she moved her children from private school to Fairview Elementary, in part so they could take the state tests.
Their methods were based on more experience, daily experience, and where every child stood on his or her own merit at the time, judged against themselves, against the child's own standard rather than against other children. And it's okay, but I know that there are some pursuits my children will have that require them to be compared with others. So if they're comfortable with it now at this age, that's going to help them later on, in my opinion.
The I-Read 3 is a separate exam from the statewide I-STEP test taken by students in 3rd through 8th grade. Monroe County Community School Corporation Elementary Education Director Cameron Rains says these standardized tests only show whether a student is meeting the minimum requirements.
It does measure some of the basic skills that students need to be successful at the next grade level. Certainly we want to go much deeper with students than that. We want them to be synthesizing, analyzing, evaluating all of the 21st century real-world skills that they'll be expected to do. But when they can do all those things, the test becomes pretty easy.
The Indiana Department of Education has made a number of changes to testing standards over the past few years. Most notably, the department has changed the way it measures schools' performance. The improvement individual students show over the course of the year factors more heavily into how a school is ranked on the state level. So, measuring students' growth can make the difference between an A and a C grade for the schools. Some administrators say, however, they aren't letting that fear affect their teaching styles.
We look forward to the state assessment in that it's one way to measure progress in our schools and in our district. And so there haven't been a lot of changes as far as the assessment structure and makeup goes. The big changes are the way that we will be graded when the results come back.
And most people agree administrators are feeling the pressure to produce good results. Several parents have said that stress gets passed on to students who are already nervous about passing state tests. But advocates of testing say exams are the only way to make sure students who are struggling to meet state standards get the help they need.
And with that, let's introduce you to this evening's panel. We're joined in the studio tonight by Vice President for Education Policy at the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, Derek Redelman. Chief Assessment Officer for the Indiana Department of Education, Wes Bruce, and Phil Harris, the Vice Chair for the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, Monroe County. Thank you all for being here, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
All right, let's get things started off with one of the questions that inevitably comes up when I start talking to parents, the issue of testing anxiety. And Kathy Fuentes-Rohr emailed us a question that really seems to encapsulate this concern this year in particular. She writes, "My child has tremendous testing anxiety and has never been able to demonstrate all of what he knows as reflected in his test scores. Now he's frantic at the idea of failing third grade based on his scores on the iRead exam," which we just discussed. He is terrified that all of his friends will move on to the fourth grade. Why would the state adopt something with such high stakes? Mr. Bruce, why don't we start with you and see if you can offer an answer to that question. Why would the state adopt something with such high stakes?
So there's a considerable body of research that looks at the consequences of not being able to read on grade level. And the legislature chose to put in place a law, in fact, that mandated this test and made third grade the benchmark. That is the place where you begin to read to learn instead of learning to read. And the policymakers make the policy. We implement a test that's fair. Certainly know that the first time that you deliver any test, there is a lot of anxiety, not just among students, but also among teachers as well.
Mr. Harris, I mean, testing at this age does seem to be critical. I mean, when you implement a test like the iRead, you're certainly filling a critical need here, aren't you?
I don't think you're filling any particularly useful need with iStep or iRead. One of the major issues here is iRead is really not measuring anything that we would functionally call reading. It's trying to get some estimate of some parts of whether children are able to produce some sounds, recognize some words, and get some basic understanding from what they read. But there really is nothing but arbitrariness associated with that standard. So there shouldn't be any kind of decision being made that's life-changing on the basis of a number.
Mr. Edelman, I want you to get your answer to that question in just a second, but Mr. Bruce, if you can just sort of weigh in on this, I mean, what is the standard that children are trying to meet when we talk about something like the iRead exam?
So iRead, the standard was set by Indiana third grade teachers, and it represents what in their judgment, and then with the review of national experts, is a minimal standard of third grade reading. So it's being able to demonstrate both in vocabulary and in comprehension. 70% of the test is reading comprehension. Those basic third grade skills. To a point that was made earlier, it is just a test where you pass or fail. It is, creates a bar. It does not measure. It wasn't built to measure higher skills, but to ensure that if a student could pass that test, we know that they do have basic third grade reading skills. Mr.
Edelman, let's bring this question to you here. In terms of the iRead, I mean, again, that same basic question, I mean, what's the purpose of having something that has such a high stakes attached to it?
Well, I think it's intended to help both students and teachers. As was noted in the opening story, I believe it's testing only the minimal skills at that grade level. We aren't testing to see whether these kids are ready for college or something like that. We're testing to see if they have the minimal basic skills that will help them succeed in future grades. And there was a note in the opening story that there's no evidence that holding kids back helps them. Well, there's plenty of evidence that just passing kids along fails them. And we've done that a lot in schooling, not just at the third grade level, but heading all the way through. And eventually it catches up. And if we think the test anxiety is tough now, wait till they have the anxiety of having reached grade levels where they cannot do the work that's in front of them, or they reach life and they aren't prepared to be part of that.
Mr. Harris, I want to send this concern back your way. I mean, Mr. Bruce mentions that this is a minimum standard, and not just with the iRead, but with the iStep examinations as well. That's sort of the thing that comes back to in a lot of this, is that we're setting a minimum bar with these standards. Are we really going to back down on trying to meet a minimum standard among kids with skills that arguably, according to these standards, kids should be able to demonstrate?
Well, a great deal of the answer to this particular issue relates to how you define reading. We generally don't have a definition of reading that as a state or as a nation or even as a profession that we can refer to. When you define reading as a set of independent acts, as I read does, it really destroys the overall purpose of reading, is which to learn and to get meaning. And when you have text, and take, for example, we have 600,000 words in our language, and they're strung together in a particular way for this particular event. It tells us next to nothing about whether a child is reading. Knowing whether a child is able to read doesn't tell us whether they are reading. And what's more fundamental is whether children are reading, not whether they are able to read. And to think that we move from this notion of learning to read and reading to learn, that's another part of this arbitrariness that's associated with it. To call this minimal standards is really a misnomer as well.
All right, I want to bring in another voice to this conversation. We have a piece of video here from Lee Heffernan, who is a literacy coach at Fairview Elementary School in Bloomington. It's part of Monroe County Community Schools. And we asked her the question of whether or not she felt that these tests were a good representation of a student's actual abilities.
I would have to say that I don't believe it's a good representation of student skills. It's a snapshot of how that child did that day with that test, but there's so many things that they're learning each day and learning how to do, and there's so many ways during the school year that they're showing growth that can never be represented on this one-off test.
So that concern that it's just a one day, it's just one picture of a student's abilities. And I want to bring this back to you, Mr. Bruce, here. I mean, this is one of those things where teachers say, eat a good breakfast. If you don't have a good breakfast on the day of the test, how can you trust the test results?
So the test results are built around, first, especially with iRead, it's a research-based test. It's based on the current reading research in terms of its makeup. It's aligned to Indiana's academic standards, the content that students are taught, the standards that were adopted by the state, and the content that's tested, that's taught every day. Certainly, tests are always just snapshots. It's important to use them in context. That's why there are 2 opportunities for students to take this test before there's going to be any retention. But you know, they are tools. All tools have some limitation, and but it's a very good tool. It's based on sound research. It uses a wide range of passages to test whether or not someone could comprehend. I would disagree somewhat that it is not a trivial test. It does use a range of different comprehensions that we're asking students to demonstrate their understanding of those words in passages that are taken from real-world texts.
Mr. Edelman, I want to ask you, because you were involved with the crafting of some of the initial models that we took these test results and tried to use them in terms of deciding how good schools were doing in terms of educating their kids. Yeah. How did you go about making those decisions, and how did you decide this is what we can use testing as kind of a measurement of how good schools are doing, and maybe if you can contrast that to how it's being done now?
Well, I think 15 years ago or so, when we were recrafting Indiana's accountability laws and rules, a package that we now call Public Law 221, we really wanted to look at a different way of measuring schools. We knew that looking at simply pass rates was not fair, because schools have kids coming in at different levels, school teachers have kids coming in at different levels. And so we really wanted to get more to improvement or growth. Now today we have a distinction between those 2 terms. Back then we didn't. really. But what we ended up is creating a matrix, essentially, that looked at what the pass rates were. But then you could move up in your rating if you improved your pass rates by certain amounts over the course of a year.
So when you say a matrix, it's sort of like there's a chart, and on one
Yes.
side there's passage on one axis, and then how much that pass rate changed on the other axis, and then
Exactly.
that determined your score.
Exactly. Now, we realized right away that that was not the best way to measure schools, because it really pushed schools to focus on the kids that were right around the cut score. And in fact, we've seen plenty of data from people who have shown that the most change is happening with kids that are right around that cut score. The ones that are right above it, they're trying to push them up above, and the ones below it, trying to push them above, and the ones that are right above, trying to keep them there. Meanwhile, the ones below sometimes just get lost, and the ones that are way above the cut score, we've actually seen evidence that some of them are actually declining. So what we wanted to get to was to look at growth. Growth meaning that did every student along that entire spectrum make a year's worth of improvement or growth in a year's worth of time? And that's what we're trying to move toward over the last 10 years or so.
Mr. Bruce, are we there yet? Do we have tests that can measure whether or not students are making a year's worth of growth between last year and this year, especially when we're not really starting out with, I mean, when you just sort of look at this as a layperson looking at this, there's no tests that kids take at the beginning of the year, and there's no test that the kids take at the end of the year, or well, there is the test that you take at the end of the year, but there's no test at the beginning. How do you know what that change is? How much growth are students showing in a year?
So we've instituted in Indiana what's called the student growth percentile, the student growth model. And what it does is it looks at all of the fourth graders in the state of Indiana, looks at their scores as fourth graders and compares that to students who started at the same place in third grade. So we're measuring their growth from where they were in third grade compared to students who were at the same place, and making a growth projection or a growth estimate for those students based on how they perform relative to other students who started at the same place in terms of achievement. And so that uses the I-STEP test to give us that metric of growth that allows us to expect growth from those students who are at the lowest end of the spectrum, as well as those students at the top end, not just those students who are sitting in the middle.
Now, before we're talking about how the standards are the minimum bar, is it appropriate to use a test that tries to measure the minimum bar to try and measure how much students are growing in a year? Because at a certain point, they're going to hit a ceiling there. I mean, if we're talking about a minimum bar here, how much more can you go above that bar before you can't demonstrate growth anymore?
So I-STEP actually has a much larger range of performance than the I-READ 3 test, which only has a single cut score. We have a cut that we call Pass Plus that about 10-12% of the students achieve. And so there is a range, but part of what's nice about the growth model that we use is it makes expectations based on where you are. So if you're a really high performing student, your growth expectations are set based on other students like you rather than all students. So it does adjust for the fact that you're performing very near the top or the ceiling of the test, and sets the expectations, measures your growth based on that.
Now, I know that this system is what we've wired in to attach to the state's A to F letter grades that are given to schools. Mr. Rettelman, do you think that we're there in terms of measuring growth for these students?
Unfortunately, I don't think we are. There are two things that are disappointing in our minds in terms of where the current rule is. One, we still primarily measure a pass-fail rate. That's the way the system was set up. 10 years ago, we knew it wasn't the best way to do it. We thought we've had a chance to move away from that, and yet right now we're still going to put schools in what we call their initial placement based on pass-fail rates, and we think that probably that's what's going to drive most of this system. The other problem with it is that the little bit of growth that is in this system is based, as Wes was just describing, on peer-based growth, looking at how students did compared to other students that are like them. And that sounds great in theory, but what that means is we aren't necessarily holding kids or trying to get kids towards our proficiency levels. Most states that we've seen have used growth to do that. We've talked a lot about how what a growth model will do is measure whether a student is making a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. When they're being compared to their peers, we're not doing that. We're not looking at whether they're making a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. We're just looking at how they're doing compared to other students who started out the same place that they did. So we're a bit concerned that, very concerned that we've kind of missed an opportunity here on this growth model.
Now we're way into the weeds here,
yes.
But before we leave it, Mr. Bruce, I just want to give you the opportunity to respond. I mean, are we doing the right thing in terms of with this growth model?
Well, everyone has a different, could have a different definition of growth. And our growth model does lay out what the expectation is for a year's growth. It does project and set an expectation for the next year's growth for students. It will chart, we can chart growth to a particular pass rate. But one of the things that we really like about our model is that it starts with the individual student. There are a number of models that do aggregate information at the classroom level, but this provides a report for every parent about whether or not their student, or how much their student has learned or grown in the past year. Could there be more emphasis on growth than we currently have in the model? Certainly, but the fact that growth is included at all, I think it's in a much better way, as Derek has already said, than the previous model where growth was measured just as passing rate change.
Mm-hmm. You're jumping to respond
and
here.
I think it's great that the Department of Education is going to create some reports that are going to be provided to parents that I hope are going to provide better information than what we've got in our overall accountability system. But I think that's going to create a whole new set of tensions where the parents want to know whether their kids are proficient or not, or whether they're on a path to be proficient. That's what they want to know. They don't want to know how their kids are doing compared to other kids. They want to know whether their kids are getting where they need to be or not. Meanwhile, the schools are going to be held accountable for a different standard. They're going to be held accountable for whether the students are doing well compared to other kids. So we're creating kind of two separate motivations here, and I think the parent one's probably more important.
Well, we'll kind of see how this all plays out here. Eventually, we'll all get the scores, and again, they're going to be based on individual students' test scores, no matter what the system is. That was the input. Again, I want to bring in another voice into the conversation here. We've got a piece of tape from Tommy Richardson, who is the principal of Lakeview Elementary, again here in Bloomington, and he sort of talks about when we discuss the idea that testing is a minimum standard. This is sort of how he expressed what it's like for students to try and meet that minimum standard.
Where someone is morally on standardized testing and all that, that can be argued, but certainly I feel we have a moral responsibility to make sure our kids were prepared, and they were tremendously prepared, and they were actually sort of joking afterwards, like, why did we stress out so bad? The test was easy and fun. So we felt very confident afterwards that, and even going in, we couldn't have prepared the kids anymore. And so we felt tremendously prepared, and that's all we can ask, and ask the kids to do their very best, and we believe that's what happened.
So Mr. Harris, I want to come to you here and just ask that if these tests are so destructive, if they have such a negative influence, why are scores up? They're up 6.5% or so from 2005, and kids are, by the metrics of this test, doing a little bit better. How is this going to bring about a lot of negative effects when so far students are, by this test, achieving more?
Well, anything you practice, you get better at. So we have seen an enormous amount of test preparation. And if you were to talk to teachers throughout the state, you will find that for the time that it takes to spend taking the test, the teachers are preparing their students probably 5 hours per hour of test administration. But the real issue here is that the standardized test is the wrong measuring device. The growth model is built on faulty assumption that learning can be quantified in a monthly increment. And there's no data, no evidence that learning can be quantified in a 1 month per 1 month time spent doing it. And that we know developmentally that doesn't fit with how the brain functions and what we know about how humans learn. So we've got some fundamental flaws in our assumptions about what we can learn from a number. And as long as we're trying to find quality in a number, we're never going to find it.
All right, so we've got about a minute and a half left here. And so as sort of kind of a closing statement, this is the opposite way of how to craft a standardized test, by the way. You're supposed to put the easy questions first. But I think that this one kind of encapsulates what the different viewpoints are here. So I want to ask our panel, and if we can start with Mr. Harris, just simply, are we better off in the state of Indiana with standardized tests or without them, Mr. Harris?
We don't know. That's the problem, is that we have no real evidence that our standardized tests inform us in any functional way.
All right, Mr. Bruce?
I would say we are much better off. We've increased the rigor of our tests over time. Our tests are highly aligned to what we expect teachers to teach in classrooms and the standards that students are expected to learn. And as you indicated, students are growing. We're seeing improvement in student test scores.
All right, and Mr. Redelman.
You know, in every part of life, people are going to be measured on what they're doing. And so, you know, for a long time, we didn't have that in education. Yes, I don't know where we'd be without standardized testing. It helps keep the schools on track. It helps parents know where things are. Yes, I think we're much better off with standardized testing.
But we still have this growth model thing. We're tying it up to something that you've expressed is problematic. And I mean, it's just sort of trying to separate for people who don't look at this growth model every day. How can we have something that's good, and then you say that what it's tied up with for a school is bad? I mean, that doesn't make...
There are a couple different questions here. One is whether testing is good, and I would say emphatically yes, that helps. Now, how we hold schools accountable for the results of those tests are an issue that we're debating. And you're right, that I think is not resolved yet. Mm-hmm. But the testing itself is critical.
Mr. Bruce, I mean, how would you drive it home that we're working with a system of good standardized tests that lead to good outcomes, not only for students, but for schools?
Yeah, it's one of those things where there has to be some balance, though. I mean, there can be too much emphasis on tests, and they are just one measure of student performance. There are things that we cannot measure with the test that are important to learn. But it's a critical measure, as Derek said. We want to be sure that students are getting a quality education, and we're holding all students, all schools accountable for delivering that.
All right. And that'll have to do it. Time sure flies, and that'll have to do it for tonight. My thanks to our panel of experts for joining us this evening, and we have continuing coverage of these issues on State Impact Indiana, which is a collaboration of Indiana's public broadcasting stations and NPR, covering education policy. Find the blog on our website, indianapublicmedia.org, and while you're there, leave a comment or see portions of this broadcast at indianapublicmedia.org/infocus, and send us your questions for next month's show. Email them to infocus@indiana.edu. And thanks also to all of you for watching and for listening. I'm Kyle Stokes. Have a great night.
Production support for InFocus is provided by Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com, and by viewers like you. Thank you.